April 12, 1917. The skies over the Western Front were thick with clouds, and the hum of propellers filled the air. In the distance, a group of German pilots surveyed the horizon, their eyes narrowing as they spotted something they hadn't expected to see: a British Sopwith Camel, lumbering upward, struggling against the heavy, damp air. Luftwaffe ace Oberleutnant Friedrich Klaus watched with a mix of amusement and disdain. His own sleek, fast-flying Albatros D-23 was a fighter's dream compared to this flying brick. "What on earth is that?" he muttered, unable to suppress a chuckle. His wingman, a seasoned pilot who'd seen it all, shrugged. "Looks like a milk bottle in the sky. We should be done with this in no time." What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this clunky machine, the Sopwith Camel, would soon be the bane of their existence. Within a few months, these seemingly slow, awkward British biplanes would transform into one of the most feared and effective fighters on the Western Front. In 1917, the skies over the Western Front were filled with the hum of combat, and the Germans couldn't help but laugh at the sight of the British Sopwith Camel. This plane was more like a lumbering sheep than a lion in the sky. It struggled to climb, couldn't turn like the nimble German fighters, and was a far cry from the sleek machines they'd come to expect. They had their hands full with bigger threats, but what they didn't know was that the Camel had something they didn't. The German pilots, armed with their superior aircraft like the Fokker Dr. 1 and Albatros D-Va, were used to outmaneuvering their enemies with grace and speed. The Camel, on the other hand, appeared sluggish, almost awkward in its movements. The British had designed it with an emphasis on power, not agility, and this showed when compared to the German designs. The Camel's powerful rotary engine made it a brute of an aircraft often difficult to control and prone to stalling in sharp turns. Its reputation among German pilots was one of disdain. The British pilots who flew it were seen as brave but unfortunate, struggling with a machine that seemed more hindrance than help. For the Germans, the Sopwith Camel was a joke, a laughable contraption that seemed destined to fail. Their pilots couldn't fathom how the British could field such a beast into a war where the stakes were so high. The German aces had no fear of the Camel. They scoffed at the thought of it ever posing a real threat. They were in the midst of fighting the likes of the nimble French Nieuport 17 seconds, the fearsome German aircraft themselves, and the more challenging British machines like the SE-5. The Camel was, to them, just another British misstep. However, the Germans underestimated the very thing that made the Camel a force to be reckoned with: its resilience. While the Camel was unwieldy and awkward to handle, it was built to endure in ways that German planes weren't. Damage and keep flying, a crucial advantage in the brutal aerial battles of the Western Front. Its heavy armament, twin 303 Browning machine guns, made it a terrifying opponent in close-quarters combat. The Germans, masters of high-speed dogfights, often found themselves caught in these close-range skirmishes, where the Camel's punchy firepower gave it an edge. The real surprise came when the German pilots realized that the Camel, while slow and cumbersome, could take on their best fighters in combat. The cockpit was a perilous place, with its cramped space and its tendency to stall, but British pilots learned to adapt. They flew low, used the Camel's heavy armament to their advantage, and made their attacks count. It wasn't the plane's agility that made it deadly, but its relentless aggression. What the Germans had mistaken for weakness was, in reality, the strength that would ultimately make the Sopwith Camel a respected and feared aircraft. As the skies grew darker with each passing month of war, the German pilots began to learn a hard lesson. Never underestimate an enemy who has the will to fight, no matter how imperfect their weapon may seem. The smirk faded, replaced with a grudging respect for the Camel's ability to hold its ground. And by the end of the war, the Sopwith Camel would have claimed more aerial victories than any other Allied fighter, leaving the Germans wondering if they had misjudged this seemingly clumsy beast after all. Imagine this. You're a German ace, staring down a plane that looks like it was built by someone who wasn't even trying. It's short, stubby, with an engine that's barely keeping up. You think to yourself, this is going to be an easy kill. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you see it? A flying brick? A catapult target? The Sopwith Camel might have looked unimpressive, but there was something hidden beneath its odd design. To the German pilots, the Camel was a joke. It had a boxy frame, a high-mounted engine, and the kind of awkward appearance that made it look more like an afterthought than a war machine. The Germans, with their sleek, cutting-edge designs like the Fokker Doctor 1 and the Albatros DV, had become accustomed to speed and grace in the air. They had been trained to take on agile, responsive planes, the kind that could twist and turn like they were born to defy gravity. So, when the Camel appeared, with its bulky, cumbersome design, they immediately wrote it off as a poor excuse for a fighter. But looks can be deceiving, and the Camel had a secret weapon that the Germans couldn't foresee. It wasn't about speed or agility, it was about survival and firepower. The Camel's rotary engine, while often considered a hindrance due to its instability, gave it a unique advantage in combat. It was an engine that could power the twin machine guns mounted on the aircraft's nose, allowing it to deliver sustained fire at close range. In aerial combat, that meant the Camel was capable of overwhelming its opponents with sheer firepower, in a way that sleek, fast fighters simply couldn't. But the real surprise came when the German pilots found themselves in close-quarter dogfights with the Camel. The German ace might have thought the British pilot would make a quick, easy target. But that was far from the truth. The Camel's design, while awkward, was tough and could take a hit and keep flying. In fact, many pilots who flew the Camel came to appreciate its ability to absorb damage that would have grounded other planes. It could take multiple rounds from enemy fire and still hold its own in the air. It wasn't about being the fastest, it was about surviving long enough to get the job done. Moreover, the Camel's design allowed for one of the most aggressive attack methods in aerial combat. With a pilot willing to take risks, the Camel could dive in and attack with brute force. Its relatively slow speed compared to its German counterparts allowed it to engage in tight, vicious turns and dives an advantage when flying at lower altitudes where precision mattered most. In these close-range, tight-turning battles, the German pilots, used to relying on their plane's nimbleness, were often caught off guard. As the war wore on, the Germans' underestimation of the Camel's capabilities became a costly mistake. The British pilots who flew it were no longer seen as mere amateurs trying to control an awkward beast. They were skilled aviators who had mastered the art of fighting with what they had. The Camel, with all its perceived flaws, became a symbol of endurance, a testament to how powerful a weapon could be when used with ingenuity and determination. In the end, it wasn't the plane's design that made it a threat. It was the unwavering will of the pilots behind it. What the Germans saw as a laughable contraption became a terror in the skies, teaching them the hard lesson that looks could be deceiving and that in war, even the most unassuming opponent could have a deadly bite. The Sopwith Camel was born out of necessity. The British needed something to counter the highly effective German Fokker triplanes. But how did this seemingly slow, heavy machine become one of the most feared fighters of the war? Let's explore how the Camel evolved from a questionable design to a killer on the Western Front. When the Camel was first conceived in 1916, it was not the sleek, agile predator it would later become. Instead, it was a quick response to the emerging dominance of the German triplane, particularly the Fokker Doctor 1, which had outclassed many of the British fighters in terms of maneuverability and firepower. The Camel's designers at Sopwith Aviation Company were tasked with creating a fighter that could counter this threat, but the initial design was anything but graceful. The Camel was heavy, difficult to handle, and far from the nimble dogfighter the British had hoped for. Its first iteration was built around a powerful rotary engine, which made the plane fast in a straight line but prone to dangerous stalls during sharp turns. The cockpit was cramped, with the pilot seated close to the engine, making visibility limited and the overall flying experience uncomfortable. The Camel's design featured a large, prominent nose, which often gave it the appearance of a beast lumbering through the sky. Early tests revealed many shortcomings, and the Camel was not an immediate success. Pilots were frequently frustrated with the plane's instability, and many complained that it was a challenge just to keep it in the air, let alone engage in combat. However, as the British pilots began to adapt to the Camel's quirks, they discovered its hidden strengths. The first major advantage lay in its firepower. Equipped with twin 303 Browning machine guns, the Camel could deliver a concentrated burst of fire that was devastating in close combat. This was a feature that set it apart from many other fighters of the time, including the Fokker Doctor I, which relied on a single machine gun. With the ability to fire simultaneously from both guns, the Camel could obliterate enemy aircraft with a flurry of well-placed rounds, even when the pilot had limited experience or control of the aircraft. The second, more surprising advantage was the Camel's survivability. Though it was far from the most agile plane in the skies, it was incredibly resilient. Its sturdy frame could absorb a surprising amount of damage without compromising flight performance. Pilots found that the Camel could take hits that would have grounded other fighters, allowing them to survive longer in battle and return to base despite suffering significant damage. This made the Camel an invaluable asset in the chaotic dogfights over the Western Front, where endurance often proved to be as important as agility. With time, the Camel's handling became more intuitive, and its weaknesses began to fade. British pilots, who had initially struggled with its unforgiving nature, began to develop tactics that played to its strengths. They learned to exploit the Camel's power in close-range combat, using its heavy firepower to break through enemy formations. The plane's bulky frame became less of a hindrance when it was flown by skilled pilots who understood how to leverage its strengths and overcome its design flaws. By the time the Camel had seen widespread service in 1917, it had evolved into a formidable fighter. While its design had been born out of a desperate need to match the Germans in the air, it soon became clear that the Camel had exceeded expectations. It was a machine that could survive, retaliate, and take on any foe that dared to cross its path. With over 1,200 kills credited to its name by the end of the war, the Sopwith Camel had transformed from a laughable oddity into one of the most successful fighters of World War I. The evolution of the Camel was a testament to the power of adaptation, proving that sometimes the most unlikely designs can become the most deadly weapons. On the other side of the line, the Germans were confident in their superior planes and pilots. They had the likes of the Fokker, Dr. I, and they were on top of the world. But there's one thing that history teaches us over and over: don't underestimate the underdog. The British Camel had a few tricks up its sleeve, and they were about to shake up the entire air war. The Germans, especially their aces, were riding high on the back of their highly effective aircraft. The Fokker Dr. I, with its distinctive triplane design, had earned a reputation for unmatched maneuverability and speed, making it the perfect tool for close-range dogfights. It was piloted by the likes of Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, whose status as a living legend only reinforced the Germans' belief in their dominance. These aircraft were agile, capable of tight turns and quick climbs, and gave the German pilots an undeniable advantage in the early stages of the war. The Germans had the upper hand, or so they thought. Meanwhile, the British were struggling to keep up. Their aircraft designs, though functional, were often considered inferior to their German counterparts. The British Royal Flying Corps, RFC, needed something to level the playing field, and in 1917 they received just that: the Sopwith Camel. Despite its rough, cumbersome appearance, the Camel was about to give the Germans a taste of their own medicine. The Camel's success came not from its design, elegance, or agility, but from a combination of firepower, durability, and the British ingenuity that had always underpinned their military efforts. Equipped with twin machine guns, the Camel could unleash a devastating barrage of fire. The Germans, who had grown accustomed to their superior machines, quickly learned that the Camel's firepower was no joke. The plane's rugged construction also gave it a surprising resilience, something that the nimble German fighters lacked. While the Fokker, Dr. I, and Albatros DV were built for speed and agility, they were often more fragile, making them vulnerable in long engagements. One of the key moments that would change the trajectory of the aerial war came when British pilots began to adapt to the Camel's unique characteristics. Although it was less agile than the Fokker Dr. I, the Camel had an edge in one area that the Germans didn't anticipate. German pilots, who were used to the lightning-fast exchanges of a dogfight, found themselves caught off guard by the Camel's ability to absorb damage and keep flying. This, combined with its lethal firepower, made it a deadly opponent in close-quarter combat, where many of the most intense dogfights took place. In addition to its endurance, the British pilots flying the Camel developed tactics that exploited the plane's strengths. The Camel was less maneuverable than the Fokker Dr. I, but it made up for that with sheer aggression. British pilots used the plane's robust frame and heavy armament to engage in tight turns and dives, where they could unleash their machine guns on German fighters before they had a chance to react. In contrast, the German pilots, trained for speed and agility, found themselves struggling to adapt to this new kind of combat. The tide began to turn as the British Camel pilots began to score more and more kills. It wasn't just a battle of technology, but a battle of adaptability and ingenuity. The Germans had the pride of superior engineering, but the British had the tenacity to make the best of what they had, turning the Camel from a supposedly laughable design into a fierce rival. By the time the war reached its final stages, the Sopwith Camel had proven itself as one of the most successful and feared aircraft of World War I, taking down more enemy planes than any other Allied fighter. The Germans, once so sure of their dominance, had underestimated the power of British ingenuity, and the underdog had come out on top. We can't talk about the Camel without discussing its signature feature, the twin 303 Browning machine guns mounted on the nose. They weren't just there for show. These guns were mounted in such a way that the pilot's hands didn't have to do much except pull the trigger, and suddenly, a hailstorm of bullets would tear through enemy planes. Talk about firepower. When the Sopwith Camel was first designed, one of the most important considerations was its offensive capabilities. Unlike many of the German aircraft, which relied on single, more precise machine guns, the Camel was armed with two Browning 303 caliber machine guns. This made it a formidable opponent in close-quarters combat, allowing the pilot to unleash a rapid and devastating barrage of bullets that could cripple or destroy an enemy aircraft in mere moments. The twin guns not only offered increased firepower but also provided a psychological edge. Seeing two streams of bullets coming at you could be enough to make even the most seasoned German ace second-guess his position. The positioning of the guns played a crucial role in their effectiveness. Mounted directly on the nose of the aircraft, they provided a direct line of fire, which greatly increased the pilot's accuracy. The guns were synchronized to fire through the rotating blades of the Camel's propeller, an engineering marvel that required precision and careful design. This meant that the pilot didn't need to aim as carefully as he would with less efficient weapon placements. The shots from the machine guns would follow the plane's trajectory, tearing through anything in the path. All the pilot had to do was point his aircraft in the right direction and pull the trigger. For pilots who had trained to master the complicated handling of the Camel, this made a world of difference in the heat of battle. One of the key advantages of these guns was their rate of fire. While German aircraft often relied on a single, more powerful gun, The Camel's twin machine guns allowed for a continuous barrage. This was especially effective in tight dogfights, where being able to pour a steady stream of bullets into an enemy fighter was more important than the raw power of each shot. The guns gave the Camel its signature ability to perform in the roughest and most chaotic close-quarters combat, where speed and agility were secondary to raw firepower. However, the twin guns didn't just give the Camel its deadly punch. They also shaped the tactics used by British pilots. The machine guns allowed the Camel to take on German aircraft in a more aggressive style. Pilots could dive into enemy formations, unleashing a short burst of gunfire and quickly turning away before the German pilots had a chance to react. This was a far cry from the more cautious, calculated maneuvers seen in earlier stages of the war. With the Camel's guns, British pilots could dictate the tempo of the fight, forcing the Germans into defensive positions rather than waiting for them to make the first move. Despite the power of the twin guns, they came with their own set of challenges. The weight of the guns, combined with the heavy recoil, made the Camel difficult to handle in certain situations, especially in tight turns. Additionally, the synchronization between the guns and the propeller was a constant source of concern, as a malfunction could result in the plane's propeller being shot out. Yet, despite these challenges, the sheer firepower of the Camel's twin, 303 seconds, became one of the most feared features in the sky. Pilots who could master the art of firing them effectively were able to claim victory after victory, and the Camel's reputation as a deadly fighter began to spread across the Western Front. By the end of the war, the Sopwith Camel's twin, 303 Browning machine guns, had become synonymous with Allied success in the air. They weren't just an addition to the aircraft, they were the heart of the Camel's design, and they gave British pilots the edge they needed to stand toe-to-toe with the German aces. When the Germans first encountered the Camel in the skies, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Here was a British plane that could actually turn faster than their more advanced machines. Pilots who thought they were dealing with a sluggish target were soon eating their words when they found themselves on the receiving end of a barrage of fire. At first glance, the Sopwith Camel appeared to be no match for the highly regarded German aircraft like the Fokker Dr. I or the Albatros DV. The Camel's boxy, awkward shape, combined with its reputation for being difficult to fly, led many German pilots to dismiss it as just another poorly designed British fighter. They assumed that its heavy, unresponsive design would make it an easy target in a dogfight. The Germans were confident that their superior maneuverability, speed, and the agility of their triplanes and biplanes would easily outclass the Camel in the skies. But the Germans quickly learned that the Camel's slow speed and heavy design hid a deadly secret. British pilots, though often outnumbered, were adapting rapidly to the Camel's unique handling characteristics. The Camel's turning radius, while not as sharp as some German planes, was deceptive. Once a British pilot had mastered its handling quirks, the Camel could execute turns that caught German pilots off guard. In a dogfight, speed was often less important than the ability to control the engagement and force the opponent into a vulnerable position. The Camel's ability to engage in tight, aggressive turns allowed British pilots to do just that, even when facing the nimblest German planes. In the heat of battle, German pilots found themselves struggling to escape the Camel's gunfire. The twin, 303 Browning machine guns mounted on the nose of the Camel delivered an overwhelming barrage of bullets, making it impossible for German pilots to outmaneuver the British aircraft in close-range combat. These machine guns allowed the Camel to unload, a continuous stream of fire, forcing the Germans to rethink their tactics. What they had once assumed was a sluggish target now had the firepower to hold its own against the elite German aces. For the Germans, the encounter was a rude awakening. The Camel's rugged construction and firepower made it much more resilient than they had anticipated. Unlike many of their more delicate fighters, the Camel could absorb significant damage and remain airborne, which made it a formidable opponent in extended engagements. This was especially true during long dogfights, where endurance often proved just as important as skill. German pilots, who had grown accustomed to the notion that their machines would outlast their enemies, quickly realized that the Camel was no easy prey. The psychological impact of the Camel's first encounters with the Germans was also significant. The German pilots, once so confident in their machines, now had to contend with an aircraft that defied their expectations. The Sopwith Camel wasn't just another British failure. It was a serious threat that had the potential to take down some of their best pilots. With each victory scored by a Camel pilot, the reputation of the aircraft grew, and the Germans were forced to reassess their perception of the war in the skies. By the time the Camel had established itself as a key player in the aerial battles of World War I, the Germans had learned a hard lesson. Never underestimate an aircraft simply because of its appearance or initial performance. What seemed like a sluggish, poorly designed machine turned out to be a cunning and lethal adversary, one that would become a symbol of British resilience and ingenuity in the skies of the Western Front. The battle between the Camel and the Fokker was inevitable. As the British pilots got better at maneuvering their unwieldy craft, the Germans found themselves up against something they weren't prepared for. The German pilots had grown accustomed to their nimble machines, but the Camel had an edge that they simply couldn't predict. At first, the Germans had little to fear from the British Sopwith Camel. Their aircraft, such as the Fokker Dr. I, were regarded as the epitome of aerial combat excellence. With its triplane design, the Fokker could outturn most other fighters, including the Camel. Its small frame and lightweight construction made it a swift and agile fighter, perfect for the tight dogfights that were the hallmark of World War I aerial combat. The Germans were used to controlling the skies with their superior maneuverability, and it seemed that no plane could match their machines in this area. But the Camel, though not as nimble, had a different advantage. It was incredibly tough and could pack a punch. The British pilots quickly discovered that the Camel's rugged construction and its deadly twin, 303 Browning machine guns, made it far more dangerous than its clumsy appearance suggested. While the German pilots were accustomed to dogfights that relied on agility, the British pilots learned to use the Camel's bulk to their advantage. They could engage in tight turns and sudden dives, where the Fokker's lightness and agility became liabilities, especially when faced with the Camel's concentrated firepower. The Germans, who relied on quick and precise maneuvers to outwit their enemies, were now facing an enemy who could take punishment and fight back with brutal force. The Camel's design made it capable of absorbing damage that would have grounded most other fighters. British pilots would often find themselves in a dogfight, taking hits, but the Camel would still hold steady, allowing them to press on. This resilience became a game-changer in the battle for air supremacy. It wasn't just about speed or agility, it was about surviving long enough to engage and deal damage. The Fokker pilots, who had learned to rely on their superior turning ability to get the drop on enemy planes, now found themselves in a fight where power and endurance often triumphed over finesse. The Camel, with its ability to dish out a steady barrage of fire, could force the more nimble Fokkers into vulnerable positions. A German pilot used to outmaneuvering an opponent would suddenly find himself in a head-to-head engagement with a Camel, unable to escape the deadly hail of bullets coming from the British plane's twin guns. As the Camel gained a reputation in the skies, the Germans were forced to adapt. They realized that they couldn't simply rely on speed and agility anymore. The British pilots were using their Camel's ability to endure and fight back as a key advantage. This realization forced German pilots to rethink their tactics and adjust their strategies. The once predictable air battles began to evolve as both sides learned from each other's successes and failures. By the time the war reached its peak, the battle between the Camel and the Fokker had come to symbolize the shifting nature of aerial combat. While the Fokker Dr. I remained a symbol of German superiority, it was the Camel that proved to be the true underdog, combining resilience, firepower, and a willingness to fight at all costs. The Camel's unexpected rise to dominance was a testament to the British ingenuity that had turned what seemed like a disadvantageous design into a lethal weapon in the hands of skilled pilots. The skies over the Western Front would never be the same. Not all pilots could tame the Camel. It was a wild beast of a machine that required a steady hand and nerves of steel. But for those who could master it, the rewards were great. Some of the greatest aces of the war flew the Camel, and they did it with such precision that they made it look effortless. Let's meet some of these legendary pilots. One of the most famous pilots to fly the Sopwith Camel was Arthur Roy Brown, a Canadian ace credited with one of the most iconic victories of the war, the death of the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. Brown's skill and bravery were evident in his approach to aerial combat, where he used his tactical acumen and his knowledge of the Camel's strengths to his advantage. Brown had initially struggled with the Camel, finding its temperamental engine and heavy handling a challenge. However, as he grew accustomed to the plane, he learned how to capitalize on its strengths. In combat, Brown's focus was always on persistence and endurance qualities that aligned perfectly with the Camel's ability to withstand damage and deliver powerful bursts of fire. Brown's patience and precision with the Camel earned him a reputation as one of the most effective pilots of the war. His victory over the Red Baron was the culmination of these qualities, proving that with the right pilot, the Sopwith Camel could become an unstoppable force. Another renowned ace who mastered the Camel was William "Billy" Bishop, a Canadian pilot who became one of the top aces of the war with 72 confirmed kills. Bishop was known for his aggressive flying style, often taking the fight to the enemy with a relentless pursuit. He was one of the first to recognize the Camel's potential in close-quarters combat, where its powerful twin machine guns could shred enemy planes with devastating accuracy. Bishop's tactical ingenuity allowed him to make the most out of the Camel's heavy frame. He would often engage in high-speed dives or take on multiple enemy aircraft at once. His victories were hard-earned and came through a combination of aggression and calculated risk-taking. Bishop's success with the Camel became legendary, and his fearlessness in the skies earned him a well-deserved place among the war's most respected pilots. While many of the most famous aces were Canadian, the Camel also had its share of British heroes, such as James McCudden, one of the top-scoring pilots of the Royal Flying Corps. McCudden was known for his meticulous approach to aerial combat. Unlike some of his peers who relied on raw aggression, McCudden approached each engagement with careful planning and an in-depth understanding of both his plane and his opponents. His ability to stay calm under pressure made him one of the most successful pilots to fly the Camel. He was adept at exploiting the plane's strength in tight dogfights, making him a formidable adversary. McCudden's disciplined approach and his ability to stay focused in the heat of battle allowed him to rack up an impressive 57 kills before his tragic death in 1918. These pilots were not just skilled aviators, they were masters of their machines, learning to adapt to the Camel's quirks and using them to their advantage. The Sopwith Camel's reputation as a challenging aircraft was a reflection of its unpredictability in the sky. But for these aces, the Camel became a weapon of incredible precision, capable of taking on the best of the enemy. Their ability to tame the beast and turn it into an instrument of destruction was a testament to their skill and bravery. In the chaotic skies above the Western Front, the pilots who flew the Camel became legends. They demonstrated that even the most challenging aircraft could be mastered with enough dedication, and their victories were not just a result of their planes, but of their exceptional abilities as pilots. The Camel, once viewed as a clumsy and unpredictable machine, became the aircraft that defined the aces of World War I. For those who could master it, the sky was theirs to command. Flying the Sopwith Camel was like riding a mechanical bull. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't easy, and you could easily end up face first in the dirt. But for those who could handle its quirks, it was a ride worth taking. Let's dive into what it felt like to soar through the skies in this beast of a plane. When pilots first climbed into the cockpit of the Sopwith Camel, they immediately encountered the aircraft's most striking feature, its unforgiving nature. The Camel was known for being a handful, a plane that could easily surprise its pilot with a sudden stall or an uncontrollable spin if not flown carefully. The cockpit itself was cramped, offering little room for comfort, with the pilot sitting almost right on top of the engine. The engine's powerful rotary design made the plane vibrate relentlessly, sending constant pulses of energy through the pilot's body. This made long flights physically exhausting, especially when combined with the extreme G-forces of aerial combat. For the unprepared, it felt as though the plane was constantly trying to shake them off, like an unruly horse throwing its rider. The plane's rotary engine gave it impressive speed in level flight, but the real thrill came when it was pushed into combat. The Camel had a reputation for being fast in a straight line, but its true strength lay in its ability to perform surprisingly sharp, aggressive turns. It wasn't nimble in the way the German Fokkers were, but with the right pilot, it could outturn almost anything in a tight dogfight. However, the trick was knowing when to push the plane and when to back off. If the pilot got too aggressive with the controls, the Camel would quickly punish them with a stall or a spin, sending them into an uncontrolled dive. There was no room for hesitation in the Camel's cockpit. Every movement had to be calculated, every maneuver executed with precision. One of the more harrowing experiences for a Camel pilot was the plane's tendency to bite when trying to pull out of a turn too sharply. The Camel's heavy frame and powerful engine created a delicate balance between maintaining control and losing it. If a pilot attempted to turn too quickly, the Camel would often snap into a spin, throwing the pilot into a violent corkscrew. Recovering from a spin required calm nerves and expert handling, as the Camel's speed could quickly cause it to plummet to the ground if not corrected in time. In a high-stakes dogfight, where the air was thick with bullets, a single mistake could lead to disaster. Yet, for those who mastered the Camel, the rewards were great. The plane's rugged construction allowed it to absorb considerable damage and keep flying, a quality that set it apart from many of its more delicate contemporaries. Even with a bullet-riddled fuselage, the Camel could keep going, making it a durable machine in the relentless chaos of the skies. This resilience, combined with the firepower of its twin, 303 Browning machine guns, made it a terrifying adversary in the right hands. Flying the Camel was a test of endurance, skill, and focus. It demanded everything from its pilot, their physical strength, mental acuity, and nerves of steel. But in return, it rewarded them with one of the most powerful tools in the sky. For those who could handle its wild ride, the Camel offered an unmatched thrill, a mix of danger, power, and victory that only a select few would experience. The Sopwith Camel was no easy ride, but for the aces who mastered it, it was a ride that defined their place in history. Something changed midway through the war. The Sopwith Camel, once dismissed as a joke, turned into a relentless predator in the skies. German pilots began to fear the distinct sound of the Camel's engine as it closed in, and suddenly, the tables had turned. The once laughable plane had found its rhythm, and it was dominating the Western Front. At first, the Camel had been regarded with skepticism. Its boxy frame, the powerful but unrefined rotary engine, and its difficult handling led many to believe it was little more than a temporary solution to the German threat. The Germans, confident in their sleek and nimble Fokker Dr. I and Albatros fighters, viewed the Camel as little more than a cumbersome nuisance, an aircraft that looked like it was destined for failure. Early reports from pilots painted a picture of frustration, with many describing the Camel as difficult to control, prone to stalls, and awkward in flight. But as the war raged on, something remarkable happened. British pilots, desperate to turn the tide in the skies, adapted to the Camel's quirks and began to exploit its advantages. The transformation began when pilots learned how to handle the Camel's rough nature, turning what was once a liability into a strength. The Camel's most notable feature was its ability to outmaneuver even the most agile German fighters in tight, low-altitude dogfights. German pilots had been accustomed to fast, nimble planes that excelled in wide turns and high-speed maneuvers, but the Camel, with its heavy frame and powerful engine, excelled in sharp, tight turns that allowed it to close in on its target before the German planes could react. This shift in combat style caught the Germans off guard, forcing them to re-evaluate their own tactics. With the guidance of experienced pilots, the Camel began to dominate in close-range combat. British pilots would often engage in aggressive tactics, diving into enemy formations and using the Camel's powerful twin guns to overwhelm their opponents with a continuous barrage of fire. The guns, mounted on the nose of the plane, gave the Camel an edge in a head-to-head engagement, allowing it to destroy enemy aircraft at a terrifying rate. The combination of devastating firepower and the plane's surprising agility in tight turns turned the Camel into a fearsome predator, especially when flown by skilled pilots who could adapt to its handling. As the war dragged on, the German pilots, once so confident in their superiority, began to notice a shift in the balance of power. The sound of the Camel's engine was no longer a joke, it was a harbinger of doom. The once laughable machine that had been dismissed as a poor imitation of German engineering had become one of the most successful fighters of the war. By the time the war reached its final stages, the Camel had amassed over 1,200 confirmed kills, making it the most successful Allied fighter of the conflict. This moment of transformation was a testament to the British ingenuity and adaptability. The Camel's rise to dominance was not due to any inherent superiority in its design, but rather the pilots who learned to make the most of what they had. As German pilots grew more cautious in the face of the Camel, the once mocked aircraft had turned the tide of the aerial war, becoming a symbol of resilience and victory. The Sopwith Camel's transformation from a troubled design into a predator in the skies marked a pivotal moment in World War I, changing the course of aerial combat and securing its place in history as one of the most effective fighters of the conflict. Flying a Camel wasn't just about outgunning your opponent, it was about breaking their spirit. German pilots who had mocked the British plane were now looking over their shoulders, knowing full well that the Camel could be coming for them at any moment. There's something about the element of surprise that makes a plane like the Camel so terrifying. The Camel's transformation from a dismissed machine to a feared predator in the skies wasn't just a matter of technical superiority, it had a profound psychological impact on German pilots. Early in the war, the Germans had been confident, even arrogant, in their mastery of aerial combat. The Fokker Dr. I triplane, in particular, was regarded as a near-perfect fighter, fast, agile, and able to dominate the skies. The British had struggled to match this level of performance, but when the Camel arrived, it forced a shift in mindset. German pilots, who had once viewed the British plane as an easy target, were now grappling with the sudden realization that the Camel wasn't the simple, slow-moving aircraft they had expected. The first signs of psychological warfare began when the Camel started to take down German planes. The Germans, who had been enjoying their aerial superiority, were forced to confront a new, more dangerous adversary. British pilots, although initially struggling with the Camel's rough handling, had adapted, and they began to use the plane's unpredictability to their advantage. The key was the Camel's ability to engage in aggressive close-range combat, where it could unleash its powerful twin machine guns in a way that was nearly impossible for more nimble German planes to counter. The distinct sound of the Camel's engine as it closed in on a German fighter was enough to send a wave of fear through enemy pilots. They knew that the British plane, once underestimated, was now a lethal threat. German pilots had grown accustomed to dominating the skies, relying on their superior speed and maneuverability. But when the Camel appeared in their rearview mirrors, it shattered that comfort. The British plane's rugged design made it tough and resilient, and its aggressive tactics caught the Germans off guard. A German pilot who had once been confident in his ability to outmaneuver an opponent would now have to face the terrifying reality that the Camel wasn't just a target, it was a machine designed to hunt him down. This shift in the psychological dynamic added an extra layer of fear to every dogfight. The psychological effect was also compounded by the Camel's ability to absorb damage and keep flying. German pilots, used to the idea that a well-placed bullet could bring down an enemy plane, were now encountering a plane that could take several hits and still remain airborne. This durability, combined with the deadly accuracy of the twin machine guns, made the Camel a plane that could wear down even the most experienced pilots. It wasn't just the physical threat the Camel posed, it was the realization that an attack by a Camel was a drawn-out, relentless affair that wore down both the body and mind. The Camel also had a psychological impact on the morale of German forces. As the British pilots became more successful, word spread quickly among the German ranks. The once mocked plane had earned a reputation for being a fearsome foe, and pilots on both sides of the line knew that the stakes had been raised. The element of surprise, combined with the Camel's firepower and resilience, turned the tide of many air battles. German pilots no longer felt invincible when they took to the skies. The Camel had made them question their superiority and forced them to adapt to a new kind of warfare, one where victory was no longer guaranteed by speed alone. In the end, the psychological warfare waged by the Sopwith Camel was just as important as the physical battles fought in the air. The fear it instilled in the hearts of German pilots, along with its reputation for aggression and resilience, made the Camel a weapon that was as terrifying as it was effective. It wasn't just a machine, it was a psychological force that transformed the nature of aerial combat during World War I. The success of the Sopwith Camel didn't just lie in its firepower or speed, it was in the lessons it taught. The British learned to adapt to the needs of aerial combat, while the Germans learned to fear the unexpected. Let's take a look at what the Camel taught both sides and how it forever changed the nature of aerial warfare. For the British, the introduction of the Camel marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of their aerial combat strategies. Initially, the Camel was considered a difficult and temperamental machine. Its powerful engine and heavy frame made it unwieldy for many pilots who struggled with its handling and control. The early days of the Camel in combat were a harsh learning curve, as pilots were forced to adapt to a machine that didn't behave like the more agile fighters they were used to. However, as the war progressed, British pilots learned how to harness the Camel's unique advantages. One of the most crucial lessons the British learned was the importance of adaptation in combat. Unlike the Germans, who relied heavily on the speed and maneuverability of their aircraft, the British pilots discovered that close-quarters combat, where the Camel's heavy armament and rugged construction were key, could be just as effective. British pilots learned to use the Camel's tendency to turn sharply and aggressively to their advantage, overcoming its awkwardness by turning it into a weapon of persistence rather than finesse. They also learned to trust the Camel's resilience. The ability to take damage and keep flying was a game-changer. As the British learned to work with the plane's quirks rather than fight against them, the Camel became a formidable machine in the skies, able to strike fear into the hearts of even the most experienced German pilots. On the other hand, the Germans were forced to learn different lessons, primarily the importance of unpredictability in aerial combat. Before the Camel's rise, the German aces, such as Manfred von Richthofen, had grown accustomed to dominating the skies with their superior maneuverability and speed. They had little reason to fear the British planes, most of which had struggled to match the agility of the German fighters. However, the Camel's sudden effectiveness in the skies shook the Germans to their core. What they had initially dismissed as a sluggish, awkward plane became a lethal predator. The Germans learned to fear the unexpected nature of the Camel, its ability to endure damage, and its surprising firepower in close-range combat. The once unbeatable Fokker Dr. I triplane, which had been synonymous with German air superiority, found itself at a disadvantage in tight, low-altitude dogfights with the rugged, aggressive Camel. The psychological impact of the Camel on the Germans was significant. They were forced to adapt to a new kind of combat that was no longer just about speed and agility. The tables had turned, and they now had to contend with a plane that, although less nimble, could deliver sustained firepower and survive in the brutal conditions of aerial combat. The Germans were also forced to reconsider their reliance on the precision of their aircraft. The Camel's resilience, paired with its twin machine guns, meant that the German pilots couldn't simply rely on their superior aerodynamics. They had to be far more cautious and strategic in their approach. The broader lesson for both sides was the shifting nature of aerial warfare. The introduction of the Camel proved that raw speed and agility weren't the only determinants of success in the skies. Endurance, firepower, and the ability to adapt quickly to the battlefield became just as important. The Camel's success underscored the importance of versatility in combat, forcing both the British and Germans to rethink their strategies and tactics. For the British, it marked a triumph of ingenuity and resilience, while for the Germans, it was a painful reminder that no matter how superior your technology may seem, you can never fully anticipate what the enemy might bring. Ultimately, the Sopwith Camel taught both sides the value of flexibility, persistence, and adaptability. It proved that sometimes the most unlikely weapon can become the deadliest when in the right hands, and it forever changed the way aerial combat would be approached for the rest of the war. It's often the underdog that gets forgotten in history. The Sopwith Camel was no exception, starting off as a plane that no one really took seriously. But as it proved its worth on the Western Front, it became one of the most iconic aircraft of the war. Let's look at how this underdog turned into a symbol of British resilience. At the outset of its service, the Camel was far from the sleek, agile fighters that many had come to expect from successful aircraft. In fact, it was often mocked for its bulky design and its tendency to behave erratically in the hands of inexperienced pilots. Early reports from the British Royal Flying Corps were far from complimentary. The plane was difficult to fly, prone to stalling, and hard to handle in combat. German pilots, who had grown accustomed to the superior maneuverability and precision of their Fokker Dr. I triplanes, initially dismissed the Camel as a joke, assuming that its awkward appearance and sluggish movements meant it was an easy target. However, the Camel had a few key qualities that set it apart from its more agile competitors, and it was these traits that would eventually win the day. The first was its raw firepower. Equipped with twin, 303 Browning machine guns, the Camel could unleash a devastating barrage of bullets at close range, something that many of the more nimble German planes couldn't counter. This ability to overwhelm an enemy with sheer firepower gave the Camel an edge in dogfights, especially at lower altitudes, where close-range combat was often the norm. The German pilots, accustomed to relying on their speed and maneuverability, found themselves at a disadvantage when faced with the relentless fire from the Camel's machine guns. Another crucial advantage the Camel had was its rugged construction. Unlike the more fragile Fokker Dr. I, the Camel was built to take damage and keep flying. The sturdy frame allowed it to absorb hits that would have grounded other aircraft, and this durability became an invaluable asset during long, drawn-out dogfights. The Camel's ability to stay airborne despite being riddled with bullets made it a formidable opponent, as German pilots quickly realized that they couldn't count on their speed alone to avoid getting hit. The real transformation of the Camel came when British pilots learned to embrace its quirks and turn them into advantages. What initially appeared to be a liability, its heavy weight, unsteady handling, and tendency to stall, became a testament to the British pilots' adaptability. They learned how to control the Camel's tendency to spin out of control by anticipating the plane's behavior and adjusting their flying accordingly. The aggressive, close-range tactics that the Camel excelled at became the hallmark of British aerial combat. and the plane's firepower, combined with the skill of the pilots, proved to be an unbeatable combination. As the war progressed, the Camel's reputation grew. Once dismissed as a weak contender, it became one of the most successful Allied fighters of World War I, with over 1,200 confirmed kills to its name by the end of the conflict. This success came not from its design or its speed, but from its ability to endure and persist in the face of overwhelming odds. The Camel embodied the spirit of the underdog, refusing to back down or be outdone, even when faced with more advanced and seemingly superior opponents. The Sopwith Camel's rise from an overlooked design to one of the most iconic aircraft of the war is a testament to the resilience of the British pilots who flew it. They took a plane that no one believed in and turned it into a symbol of victory. In the skies above the Western Front, the Camel proved that sometimes the most unlikely contender could emerge victorious, showing that heart, determination, and the willingness to adapt could overcome even the most daunting challenges. In the end, the Camel became more than just an aircraft. It became a symbol of British resilience and an enduring reminder of how the underdog can triumph against the odds. There's nothing quite like the feeling of being caught off guard by something you never expected. German pilots who initially laughed at the Sopwith Camel soon found themselves regretting their arrogance as they saw the destruction it caused. The Camel didn't just defeat the Germans, it embarrassed them in the process. At the start of World War I, the Germans had an undeniable sense of superiority in the air. Their advanced fighter planes, such as the Fokker Dr. I triplane, were the stuff of legend, admired for their agility and speed. The Germans, particularly their aces, were accustomed to dominating the skies with machines that outmaneuvered the opposition. When the British introduced the Sopwith Camel, many German pilots viewed it as an inferior machine, bulky, unrefined, and sluggish. The Camel's appearance alone made it seem like an easy target. But what the Germans failed to realize was that the Camel's design was deceptive, hiding the deadly potential of a well-armed and resilient aircraft. At first, German pilots scoffed at the Camel. Their advanced technology and decades of aviation experience led them to believe that the British plane could never compete with their highly maneuverable Fokker Dr. I. However, this arrogance was short-lived. As British pilots began to figure out the Camel's quirks and work around its less-than-ideal handling, the Germans quickly found themselves in an unexpected fight. The Camel's strength was not in its speed or agility, but in its relentless aggression and powerful armament. The Camel's twin, 303 Browning machine guns, delivered a barrage of fire that the nimble German planes couldn't counter at close range. The British pilots, once outgunned and outmaneuvered, adapted their tactics to suit the Camel's strengths, especially its ability to handle tight turns and engage in aggressive attacks. German pilots, who had relied on their superior speed and ability to cut sharp corners, now found themselves being outgunned and caught in the aggressive, low-altitude dogfights that the Camel excelled in. As the British pilots honed their skills and mastered the Camel's unique handling, the Germans began to feel the weight of their initial dismissal. The Camel didn't just challenge their superiority, it tore into their confidence. The once unbeatable Fokker Dr. I, with all its glory, now faced a plane that, despite its seemingly clumsy design, could outfight it in the most brutal and unforgiving conditions. The realization that the Camel could endure damage, keep fighting, and bring down enemy planes with deadly accuracy hit the German pilots hard. They had underestimated the British machine, and it was now costing them dearly. What made the situation even worse for the Germans was the psychological aspect of the Camel's success. German pilots who had grown used to being the dominant force in the air suddenly found themselves in a situation where they could no longer predict their opponent's moves. The Camel's unpredictability, combined with its firepower, created a sense of unease that unsettled even the most experienced aces. They began to fear the sound of the Camel's engine closing in not just for its destructive capability, but for its uncanny ability to turn the tide of battle in an instant. By the time the war reached its climax, the Sopwith Camel had become one of the most successful fighters of the conflict, with over 1,200 kills to its name. German pilots, who had once laughed at the British machine, were now forced to contend with a plane that had proven itself as lethal as any German fighter. The Camel's rise to power had not only shifted the balance of air superiority, but had also left a deep scar on the pride of the German Luftstreitkräfte. In the end, the Camel's unexpected dominance was a reminder of how overconfidence can lead to downfall, and how the underdog, when underestimated, can become a force that reshapes history. As the war came to a close, the Camel's time in the spotlight started to fade. But even as newer and more advanced planes took to the skies, the Sopwith Camel remained a symbol of the British spirit during World War I. Let's reflect on how this once mocked machine became one of the most important fighters of the Great War. By the end of World War I, the technological landscape of aerial combat had begun to shift. The introduction of faster, more maneuverable aircraft, such as the SE-5A and the Bristol fighter, signaled the dawning of a new era in fighter aviation. These planes, with their improved design and greater stability, offered pilots a more refined flying experience compared to the wild and unpredictable Sopwith Camel. As a result, the Camel began to phase out of frontline service, and newer models replaced it in the skies over Europe. However, despite its diminishing presence in the later stages of the war, the legacy of the Sopwith Camel endured. It had played a crucial role in turning the tide of aerial combat during some of the most intense battles of World War I. The Camel's aggressive firepower, resilience, and adaptability had made it the aircraft that embodied British perseverance and ingenuity. For many British pilots, it was the Camel's spirit, the relentless drive to push forward despite its flaws, that came to symbolize the very essence of the British effort during the war. The Camel's success had been earned in the heat of battle, where British pilots had learned to master its quirks and make the most of its formidable capabilities. It was a plane that, despite its rough handling and heavy frame, could outfight almost anything in the air when flown by skilled aviators. In close-range combat, where the ability to deliver a constant stream of fire was paramount, the Camel stood unmatched. Its twin, 303 Browning machine guns, mounted directly on the nose, allowed it to unleash devastating barrages that made short work of enemy planes. This firepower, combined with the Camel's ability to absorb damage and keep flying, turned it into a machine feared by German pilots, who had once dismissed it as an inferior opponent. As newer models came into service, the Camel found itself relegated to secondary roles, but its legacy as one of the most successful and iconic fighters of the war was secured. By the time the armistice was signed, the Camel had claimed over 1,200 confirmed kills, making it the most successful Allied fighter in World War I. It had proven itself in countless dogfights, often against superior opponents, and had shown that even an imperfect design could triumph when paired with the right pilots. The Sopwith Camel's story was not just one of engineering success, but of perseverance and adaptation in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a testament to the British spirit during the war, a plane that started as an underdog, struggled through its early trials, and eventually became the stalwart defender of the skies over the Western Front. The Camel's role in World War I had demonstrated that success in aerial combat was not just about speed, agility, or sleek design. It was about resilience, firepower, and the willingness to adapt to the changing tides of warfare. As the war ended and the world moved into a new era, the Camel faded from the front lines, but its place in history remained secure, a symbol of how the right plane, even if it wasn't perfect, could become a game-changer on the battlefield. The Camel's era had ended, but its legacy lived on as a symbol of the bravery, determination, and ingenuity that defined the British effort during the Great War.